Hello, and welcome back to Baby Alice's Stories. We now return to Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm by Kate Douglas Wiggin. Chapter 22 Clover Blossoms and Sunflowers. "How do you do, girls?" said Huldah Meserve, peeping in at the door. "Can you stop studying a minute and show me your room? Say, I've just been down to the store and bought me these gloves, for I was bound I wouldn't wear mittens this winter. They're simply too contrived."
Countrified.
"For I was bound I wouldn't wear mittens this winter. They're simply too countrified. It's your first year here, and you're younger than I am, so I suppose you don't mind. But I simply suffer if I don't keep up some kind of style. Say, your room is simply too cute for words. I don't believe any of the others can begin to compare with it. I don't know what gives it that simply gorgeous look, whether it's the full curtains, or that elegant screen, or Rebecca's lamp. But you certainly do have a faculty for fixing up. I like a pretty room too, but I never have a minute to attend to mine. I'm always so busy on my clothes that half the time I don't get my bed made up till noon. And after all, having no callers but the girls, it don't make much difference. When I graduate, I'm going to fix up our parlor at home, so it'll be simply regal. I've learned decalcomania, and after I take up lustre painting, I shall have it simply stiff with drapes and tidies and plaques and sofa pillows, and make mother let me have a fire and receive my friends their evenings. May I dry my feet at your register? I can't bear to wear rubbers unless the mud or the slush is simply knee deep. They make your feet look so awfully big. I had such a fuss getting this pair of French-heeled boots that I don't intend to spoil the looks of them with rubbers any oftener than I can help. I believe boys notice feet quicker than anything. Elmer Webster stepped on one of mine yesterday when I accidentally had it out in the aisle. And when he apologized after class, he said he wasn't so much to blame, for the foot was so little he really couldn't see it. Isn't he perfectly great? Of course, that's only his way of talking, for after all, I only wear a number 2. But these French heels and pointed toes do certainly make your foot look smaller, and it's always said a high instep helps too. I used to think mine was almost a deformity, but they say it's a great beauty. Just put your feet beside mine, girls, and look at the difference. Not that I care much, but just for fun." "My feet are very comfortable where they are," responded Rebecca dryly. "I can't stop to measure insteps on algebra days. I've noticed your habit of keeping a foot in the aisle ever since you had those new shoes, so I don't wonder it was stepped on. Perhaps I am a little mite conscious of them, because they're not so very comfortable at first, till you get them broken in. Say, haven't you got a lot of new things?" "Our Christmas presents, you mean?" said Emma Jane. "The pillowcases are from Mrs. Cobb, the rug from Cousin Mary in North Riverboro, the scrap basket from Living and Dick. We gave each other the bureau and the cushion covers, and the screen is mine from Mr. Ladd." "Well, you were lucky when you met him. Gracious, I wish I could meet somebody like that. The way he keeps it up, too. It just hides your bed, doesn't it? And I always say that a bed takes the style of any room, especially when it's not made up. Though you have an alcove, and it's the only one in the whole building. I don't see how you managed to get this good room when you're such new scholars," she finished discontentedly. We shouldn't have, except that Ruth Berry had to go away suddenly on account of her father's death. This room was empty, and Miss Maxwell asked if we might have it, returned Emma Jane. The great and only Max is more stiff and standoffish than ever this year, said Huldah. I've simply given up trying to please her, for there's no justice in her. She is good to her favorite, but she doesn't pay the least attention to anybody else except to make sarcastic speeches about things that are none of her business. I wanted to tell her yesterday it was her place to teach me Latin, not manners. I wish you wouldn't talk against Miss Maxwell to me, said Rebecca hotly. I know how I feel. You know how I feel. I know, but I can't understand how you can abide her. I not only abide, I love her, exclaimed Rebecca. I wouldn't let the sun shine too hot on her or the wind blow too cold. I'd like to put a marble platform in her classroom and have her sit in a velvet chair behind a golden table. Well, don't have a fit because she can sit where she likes for all of me. I've got something better to think of. And Huldah tossed her head. Isn't this your study hour? Asked Emma Jane to stop possible discussion. Yes, but I lost my Latin grammar yesterday. I left it in the hall half an hour while I was having a regular scene with Herbert Dunn. I haven't spoken to him for a week and gave him back his class pen. He was simply furious. Then when I came back to the hall, the book was gone. I had to go downtown for my gloves and to the principal's office to see if the grammar had been handed in, and that's the reason I'm so fine. Huldah was wearing a woolen dress that had once been gray, but had been dyed a brilliant blue. She added 3 rows of white braid and large white pearl buttons to her gray jacket, in order to make it a little more dressy. Her gray felt hat had a white feather on it, and a white tissue veil with large black dots made her delicate skin look brilliant. Rebecca thought how lovely the knot of red hair looked under the hat behind, and how the color of the front had been dulled by incessant frizzing with curling irons. Her open jacket disclosed a galaxy of souvenirs pinned to the ground of bright blue, a small American flag, a button of the Wareham Rowing Club, and 1 or 2 society pins. These decorations proved her popularity in very much the same way as do the cotillion favors hanging on the bedroom walls of the fashionable belle. She had been pinning and unpinning, arranging and disarranging her veil ever since she entered the room, in the hope that the girls would ask her whose ring she was wearing this week. But although both had noticed the new ornament instantly, wild horses could not have drawn the question from them. Her desire to be asked was too obvious. With her gay plumage, her nods and becks and wreathed smiles, and her cheerful cackle, Huldah closely resembled the parrot in Wordsworth's poem. Arch, volatile, a sportive bird, by social glee inspired, ambitious to be seen or heard, and pleased to be admired. Right? Miss Morrison thinks the grammar will be returned and lent me another, Huldah continued. He was rather snippy about my leaving the book in the hall. There was a perfectly elegant gentleman in the office, a stranger to me. I wish he was a new teacher, but there's no such luck. He was too young to be the father of any of the girls, and too old to be a brother. But he was handsome as a picture and had on an awful stylish suit of clothes. He looked at me about every minute I was in the room and made me so embarrassed I couldn't hardly answer Mr. Morrison's questions straight. You'll have to wear a mask pretty soon if you're going to have any comfort, Huldah, said Rebecca. Did he offer to lend you his class pin, or has it been so long since he graduated that he's left off wearing it? And tell us now whether the principal asked for a lock of your hair to put in his watch." This was all said merrily and laughingly, but there were times when Huldah could scarcely make up her mind whether Rebecca was trying to be witty or whether she was jealous, but generally decided it was merely the latter feeling, rather natural in a girl who had little attention. He wore no jewelry but a cameo scarf pin and a perfectly gorgeous ring, a queer kind of one that wound round and round his finger. Oh dear, I must run. Where has the hour gone? There's the study bell. Rebecca had pricked up her ears at Huldah's speech. She remembered a certain strange ring, and it belonged to the only person in the world, save Miss Maxwell, who appealed to her imagination, Mr. Aladdin. Her feeling for him and that of Emma Jane was a mixture of romantic and reverent admiration for the man himself and the liveliest gratitude for his beautiful gifts. Since they first met him, not a Christmas had gone by without some remembrance for them both. Remembrances chosen with the rarest taste and forethought. Emma Jane had seen him only twice, but he had called several times at the brick house, and Rebecca had learned to know him better. It was she, too, who always wrote the notes of acknowledgment and thanks, taking infinite pains to make Emma Jane's quite different from her own. Sometimes he had written from Boston and asked her the news of Riverboro, and she had sent him pages of quaint and childlike gossip, interspersed on 2 occasions with poetry, which he read and reread with infinite relish. If Huldah's stranger should be Mr. Aladdin, would he come to see her? And could she and Emma Jane show him their beautiful room with so many of his gifts in evidence? When the girls had established themselves in Wareham as real boarding pupils, it seemed to them existence was as full of joy as it well could hold. The first winter was, in fact, the most tranquilly happy of Rebecca's school life, a winter long to be looked back upon. She and Emma Jane were roommates, and had put their modest passions together to make their surroundings pretty and homelike. The room had to begin with a cheerful red ingrain carpet and a set of maple furniture. As to the rest, Rebecca had furnished the ideas and Emma Jane the materials and labor. A method of dividing responsibilities that seemed to suit the circumstances admirably. Mrs. Perkins's father had been a storekeeper, and on his death had left the goods of which he was possessed to his married daughter. The molasses, vinegar, and kerosene had lasted the family for 5 years, and the Perkins attic was still a treasure house of ginghams, cottons, and Yankee notions. So at Rebecca's instigation, Mrs. Perkins had made full curtains and lambrequins of unbleached muslin, which she had trimmed and looped back with bands of turkey red cotton. There were 2 table covers to match, and each of the girls had her study corner. Rebecca, after much coaxing, had been allowed to bring over her precious lamp, which would have given a luxurious air to any apartment. And when Mr. Aladdin's last Christmas presents were added, the Japanese screen for Emma Jane, and the little shelf of English poets for Rebecca, they declared that it was all quite as much fun as being married and going to housekeeping. The day of Huldah's call was Friday, and on Fridays from 3 to 4:30, Rebecca was free to take a pleasure to which she looked forward the entire week. She always ran down the snowy path, through the pine woods at the back of the seminary, and coming out on a quiet village street, went directly to the large white house where Miss Maxwell lived. The maid of all work answered her knock, and she took off her hat and cape and hung them in the hall, put her rubber shoes and umbrella carefully in the corner, and then opened the door of paradise. Miss Maxwell's sitting room was lined on two sides with bookshelves, and Rebecca was allowed to sit before the fire and browse among the books to her heart's delight for an hour or more. Then Miss Maxwell would come back from her class, and there would be a precious half hour of chat before Rebecca had to meet Emma Jane at the station and take the train for Riverboro, where her Saturdays and Sundays were spent, and where she was washed, ironed, mended, and examined, approved and reproved, warned and advised in quite sufficient quantity to last her the succeeding week. On this Friday, she buried her face in the blooming geraniums on Miss Maxwell's plant stand, selected Romola from one of the bookcases, and sank into a seat by the window with a sigh of infinite content. She glanced at the clock now and then, remembering the day on which she had been so immersed in David Copperfield that the Riverboro train had no place in her mind. The distracted Emma Jane had refused to leave without her, and had run from the station to look for her at Miss Maxwell's. There was but one later train, and that went only to a place 3 miles the other side of Riverboro, so that the two girls appeared at their respective homes long after dark, having had a weary walk in the snow. When she had read for half an hour, she glanced out of the window and saw two figures issuing from the path through the woods. The knot of bright hair and the coquettish hat could belong to but one person, and her companion, as the couple approached, proved to be none other than Mr. Aladdin. Huldah was lifting her skirts daintily and picking safe stepping places for the high-heeled shoes, her cheeks glowing, her eyes sparkling under the black and white veil. Rebecca slipped from her post by the window to the rug before the bright fire and leaned her head on the seat of the great easy chair. She was frightened at the storm in her heart, at the suddenness with which it had come on, as well as at the strangeness of an entirely new sensation. She felt all at once as if she could not bear to give up her share of Mr. Aladdin's friendship to Huldah. Huldah, so bright, saucy, and pretty, so gay and ready, and such good company. She had always joyfully admitted Emma Jane into the precious partnership, but perhaps unconsciously to herself, she had realized that Emma Jane had never held anything but a secondary place in Mr. Aladdin's regard. Yet who was she herself, after all, that she could hope to be first? Suddenly the door opened softly, and somebody looked in. Somebody who said, "Miss Maxwell? Miss Maxwell told me I should find Miss Rebecca Randall here." Rebecca started at the sound and sprang to her feet, saying joyfully, "Mr. Aladdin! Oh, I knew you were in Wareham, and I was afraid you wouldn't have time to come and see us." "Who is us? The aunts are not here, are they?" "Oh, you mean the rich blacksmith's daughter, whose name I can never remember. Is she here?" "Yes, and my roommate," answered Rebecca, who thought her own knell of doom had sounded as if he had forgotten Emma Jane's name. The light in the room grew softer, the fire crackled cheerily, and they talked of many things, until the old sweet sense of friendliness and familiarity crept back into Rebecca's heart. Adam had not seen her for several months, and there was much to be learned about school matters as viewed from her own standpoint. He had already inquired concerning her progress from Mr. Morrison. "Well, little Miss Rebecca," he said, rousing himself at length, I must be thinking of my drive to Portland. There is a meeting of railway directors there tomorrow, and I always take this opportunity of visiting the school and giving my valuable advice concerning its affairs, education, and financial. It seems funny for you to be a school trustee, said Rebecca contemplatively. I can't seem to make it fit. You are a remarkably wise young person, and I quite agree with you, he answered. The fact is, he added soberly, I accepted the trusteeship in memory of my poor little mother, whose last happy years were spent here. That was a long time ago. Let me see. I am 32, only 32, despite an occasional gray hair. My mother was married a month after she graduated, and she lived only until I was 10. Yes, it is a long way back to my mother's time here, though the school was 15 or 20 years old then, I believe. Would you like to see my mother, Miss Rebecca? The girl took the leather case gently and opened it to find an innocent, pink and white daisy of a face, so confiding, so sensitive, that it went straight to her heart. It made Rebecca feel old, experienced, and maternal. She longed on the instant to comfort and strengthen such a tender young thing. Oh, what a sweet, sweet, flowery face, she whispered softly. The flower had to bear all sorts of storms, said Adam gravely. The bitter weather of the world bent its slender stalk, bowed its head, and dragged it to the earth. I was only a child, and could do nothing to protect and nourish it, and there was no sense, and there was no one else to stand between it and trouble. Now I have success and money and power, all that would have kept her alive and happy, and it is too late. She died for lack of love and care, nursing and cherishing, and I could never forget it. All that has come to me seems now and then so useless, since I cannot share it with her. This was a new Mr. Aladdin, and Rebecca's heart gave a throb of sympathy and comprehension. This explained the tired look in his eyes, the look that peeped out now and then under all his gay speech and laughter. I'm so glad I know, she said, and so glad I could see her just as she was when she tied that white muslin hat under her chin and saw her yellow curls and her sky blue eyes in the glass. Mustn't she have been happy? I wish she could have been kept so, and have lived to see you grow up strong and good. My mother is always sad and busy, but once when she looked at John, I heard her say, he makes up for everything. That's what your mother would have thought about you if she had lived, and perhaps she does as it is. You are a comforting little person, Rebecca, said Adam, rising from his chair. As Rebecca rose, the tears still trembling on her lashes, looked at her suddenly. He looked at her suddenly, as with new vision. Goodbye, he said, taking her slim brown hands in his, adding as if he saw her for the first time, why, little Rose Red Snow White is making way for a new girl. Burning the midnight oil and doing 4 years' work in 3 is supposed to dull the eye and blanch the cheek. Yet Rebecca's eyes are bright and she has a rosy color. Her long braids are looped one on the other so that they make a black letter U behind, and they are tied with grand bows at the top. She is so tall that she reaches almost to my shoulder. This will never do in the world. How will Mr. Aladdin get on without his comforting little friend? He doesn't like grown-up young ladies in long trains and wonderful fine clothes. They frighten and bore him. Oh, Mr. Aladdin, cried Rebecca eagerly, taking his jest quite seriously. I'm not 15 yet, and now it will be 3 years before I'm a young lady, and it will be 3 years before I'm a young lady. Please don't give me up until you have to. I won't, I promise you that, said Adam. Rebecca, he continued, after a moment's pause, who is that young girl with a lot of pretty red hair and very citified manners? She escorted me down the hill. Do you know whom I mean? It must be Huldah Meserve. She is from Riverboro. Adam put a finger under Rebecca's chin and looked into her eyes. Eyes as soft as clear, as unconscious and childlike as they had been when she was 10. He remembered the other pair of challenging blue ones that had darted coquettish glances through half-dropped lids, shot arrowy beams from under archly lifted brows, and said gravely, Don't form yourself on her, Rebecca. Clover blossoms that grow in the fields beside Sunnybrook mustn't be tied in the same bouquet with gaudy sunflowers. They are too sweet and fragrant and wholesome. Chapter 23. The Hill Difficulty. The first happy year at Wareham, with its widened skyline, its larger vision, its greater opportunity, was over and gone. Rebecca had studied during the summer vacation and had passed, on her return in autumn, certain examinations which would enable her, if she carried out the same program the next season, to complete the course in 3 instead of 4 years. She came off with no flying colors. That would have been impossible in consideration of her inadequate training. But she did wonderfully well in some of the required subjects. And so brilliantly in others that the average was respectable. She would never have been a remarkable scholar under any circumstances, perhaps, and she was easily outstripped in mathematics and the natural sciences by a dozen girls. But in some inexplicable way, she became, as the months went on, the foremost figure in the school. When she had entirely forgotten the facts which would enable her to answer a question fully and conclusively, she commonly had some original theory to expand. It was not always correct, but it was generally unique and sometimes amusing. She was only fair in Latin or French grammar, but when it came to translation, her freedom, her choice of words, her sympathetic understanding of the spirit of the text made her the delight of her teachers and the despair of her rivals. She can be perfectly ignorant of a subject, said Miss Maxwell to Adam Ladd, but entirely intelligent the moment she has a clue. Most of the other girls are full of information and as stupid as shape. Rebecca's gifts had not been discovered save by the few during the first year, when she was adjusting herself quietly to the situation. She was distinctly one of the poorer girls. She had no fine dresses to attract attention, no visitors, no friends in town. She had more study hours and less time, therefore, for the companionship of other girls, gladly as she would have welcomed the gaiety of that side of school life. Still, water will find its own level in some way, and by the spring of the second year she had naturally settled into the same sort of leadership which had been hers in the smaller community of Riverboro. She was unanimously elected assistant editor of the Wareham School Pilot, being the first girl to assume that enviable, though somewhat arduous and thankless position. And when her maiden number went to the Cobbs, Uncle Jerry and Aunt Sarah could hardly eat or sleep for pride. "She'll always get votes," said Huldah Meserve when discussing the election, "for whether she knows anything or not. She looks as if she did, and whether she's capable of filing an office or not, she looks as if she was. I only wish I was tall and dark and had the gift of making people believe I was great things like Rebecca Randall. There's one thing. Though the boys call her handsome, you notice they don't trouble her with much attention." It was a fact that Rebecca's attitude towards the opposite sex was still somewhat indifferent and oblivious, even for 15 and a half. No one could look at her and doubt that she had potentialities of attraction latent within her somewhere, but that a side of her nature was happily biding its time. A human being is capable only of a certain amount of activity at a given moment, and it will inevitably satisfy first its most pressing needs, its most ardent desires, its chief ambitions. Rebecca was full of small anxieties and fears, for matters were not going well at the brick house, and were anything but hopeful at the home farm. She was overbusy and overtaxed, and her thoughts were naturally drawn towards the difficult problems of daily life, of daily living. It had seemed to her during the autumn and winter of that year as if her Aunt Miranda had never been, save at the very first, so censorious, severely critical of others, censorious, hypercritical. It had seemed to her during the autumn and winter of that year as if her Aunt Miranda had never been, save at the very first, so censorious and so fault-finding. One Saturday, Rebecca ran upstairs and, bursting into a flood of tears, exclaimed, "Aunt Jane, it seems as if I never could stand her continual scoldings. Nothing I can do suits Aunt Miranda. She's just said it will take me my whole life to get the Randall out of me, and I'm not convinced that I want it all out. So there we are." Aunt Jane, never demonstrative, cried with Rebecca as she attempted to soothe her. "You must be patient," she said, wiping first her own eyes and then Rebecca's. "I haven't told you, for it isn't fair you should be troubled when you're studying so hard, but your Aunt Miranda isn't well. One Monday morning about a month ago, she had a kind of faint spell. It wasn't bad, but the doctor is afraid it was a shock, and if so, it's the beginning of the end. Seems to me she's failing right along, and that's what makes her so fretful and easily vexed. She has other troubles, too, that you don't know anything about. And if you're not kind to your Aunt Miranda now, child, you'll be dreadful sorry sometime." All the temper faded from Rebecca's face, and she stopped crying to say penitently, "Oh, the poor dear thing. I won't mind a bit what she says now. She's just asked me for some milk toast, and I was dreading to take it to her. But this will make everything different. Don't worry yet, Aunt Jane, for perhaps it won't be as bad as you think." So when she carried the toast to her aunt a little later, it was in the best gilt-edged china bowl with a fringed napkin on the tray and a sprig of geranium lying across the salt cellar. "Now, Aunt Miranda," she said cheerily, "I expect you to smack your lips and say this is good. It's not Randall, but Sawyer milk toast." "You've tried all kinds on me, one time and another," Miranda answered. "This tastes real kind of good, but I wish you hadn't wasted that nice geranium." "You can't tell what's wasted," said Rebecca philosophically. "Perhaps that geranium has been hoping this long time it could brighten somebody's supper, so don't disappoint it by making believe you don't like it. I've seen geraniums cry in the very early morning." The mysterious trouble to which Jane had alluded was a very real one, but it was held in profound secrecy. $2,500 of the small Sawyer property had been invested in the business of a friend of their father's and had returned them a regular annual income of $100. The family friend had been dead for some 5 years, but his son had succeeded to his interests, and all went on as formerly. Suddenly, there came a letter saying that the firm had gone into bankruptcy, that the business had been completely wrecked, and that the Sawyer money had been swept away with everything else. The loss of $100 a year is a very trifling matter, but it made all the difference between comfort and self-denial to the two old spinsters. Their manner of life had been so rigid and careful that it was difficult to economize any further, and the blow had fallen just when it was most inconvenient, for Rebecca's school and boarding expenses, small as they were, had to be paid promptly and in cash. "Can we possibly go on doing it? Shan't we have to give up and tell her why?" asked Jane tearfully of the elder sister. "We have put our hand to the plow, and we can't turn back," answered Miranda in her grimmest tone. "We've taken her away from her mother and offered her an education, and we've got to keep our word. She's Aurelia's only hope for years to come, to my way of thinking. Hannah's beau takes all her time and thought, and when she gets a husband, her mother'll be out of sight and out of mind. John, instead of farming, thinks he must be a doctor, and if folks wasn't getting unhealthy enough these days without turning out more young doctors to help him into their graves. No, Jane, we'll skimp and do without, and plan to get along on our interest money somehow. But we won't break into our principal, whatever happens." Breaking into the principal was, in the minds of most thrifty New England women, a sin only second to arson, theft, or murder. And though the rule was occasionally carried too far for common sense, as in this case, where two elderly women of 60 might reasonably have drawn something from their little hoard in time of special need, it doubtless wrought more of good than evil in the community. Rebecca, who knew nothing of their business affairs, merely saw her aunts grow more and more saving, pinching here and there, cutting off this and that relentlessly. Less meat and fish were bought. The woman who had lately been coming 2 days a week for washing, ironing, and scrubbing was dismissed. The old bonnets of the season before were brushed up and retrimmed. There were no drives to Moderation or trips to Portland. Economy was carried to its very extreme. But though Miranda was well nigh as gloomy and uncompromising in her manner and conversation as a woman could well be, she at least never twitted her niece of being a burden, So Rebecca's share of the Sawyers' misfortunes consisted only in wearing her old dresses, hats, and jackets, without any apparent hope of a change. There was, however, no concealing the state of things at Sunnybrook, where chapters of accidents had unfolded themselves in a sort of serial story that had run through the year. The potato crop had failed. There were no apples to speak of. The hay had been poor. Aurelia had turns of dizziness in her head. Mark had broken his ankle. As this was his fourth offense, Miranda inquired how many bones there were in the human body. "So't they'd know when Mark got through breaking them." The time for paying the interest on the mortgage, that incubus that had crushed all the joy out of the Randall household, had come and gone. There was no possibility, for the first time in 14 years, of paying the required $48. The only bright spot in the horizon was Hannah's engagement to Will Melville, a young farmer whose land joined Sunnybrook, who had a good house, was alone in the world and his own master. Hannah was so satisfied with her own unexpectedly radiant prospects that she hardly realized her mother's anxieties, for there are natures which flourish in adversity and deteriorate when exposed to sudden prosperity. She had made a visit of a week at the brick house, and Miranda's impression, conveyed in privacy to Jane, was that Hannah was close as the bark of a tree, and considerable selfish too. That when she'd climb as fur as she could in the world, she'd kick the ladder out from under her everlasting quick. That on being sounded as to her ability to be of use to the younger children in the future, she said she guessed she'd done her share already, and she wasn't going to burden Will with her poor relations. "She's Susan Randall through and through," ejaculated Miranda. "I was glad to see her face turn towards temperance. If that mortgage is ever cleared from the farm, 'twon't be Hannah that'll do it. It'll be Rebecca or me." Chapter 24. Aladdin rubs his lamp. Your esteemed contribution, entitled Wareham Wildflowers, has been accepted for the pilot, Miss Perkins, said Rebecca, entering the room where Emma Jane was darning the firm's stockings. "I stayed to tea with Miss Maxwell, but came home early to tell you." "You are joking, Becky," faltered Emma Jane, looking up from her work. "Not a bit. The senior editor read it and thought it highly instructive. It appears in the next issue." "Not in the same number with your poem about the Golden Gates that close behind us when we leave school?" said Emma Jane, and Emma Jane held her breath as she awaited the reply. "Even so, Miss Perkins." "Rebecca," said Emma Jane, with the nearest approach to tragedy that her nature would permit, "I don't know as I shall be able to bear it if anything happens to me. I ask you solemnly to bury that number of the pilot with me." Rebecca did not seem to think this the expression of an exaggerated state of feeling, inasmuch as she replied, "I know, that's just the way it seemed to me at first, and even now, whenever I'm alone and take out the pilot, back numbers to read over my contributions, I almost burst with pleasure, and it's not that they are good either, for they look worse to me every time I read them." "If you would only live with me in some little house when we get older," mused Emma Jane, as with her darning needle poised in air, she regarded the opposite wall dreamily. I would do the housework and cooking and copy all your poems and stories and take them to the post office. You needn't do anything but write. It would be perfectly elegant. I'd like nothing better if I hadn't promised to keep house for John, replied Rebecca. He won't have a house for a good many years, will he? No, sighed Rebecca ruefully, flinging herself down by the table and resting her head on her hand. Not unless we can contrive to pay off that detestable mortgage. The day grows farther off instead of nearer now that we haven't paid the interest this year. She pulled a piece of paper towards her and, scribbling idly on it, read aloud in a moment or two. Will you pay a little faster? Said the mortgage to the farm. I confess I'm very tired of this place. The weariness is mutual, Rebecca Randall cried. I'd never gaze upon your face. A note has face, observed Emma Jane, who was gifted in arithmetic. I didn't know that a mortgage had. A mortgage has, said Rebecca vengefully. I should know him if I met him in the dark. Wait, and I'll draw him for you. It will be good for you to know how he looks, and then when you have a husband and 7 children, you won't allow him to come anywhere within a mile of your farm. The sketch, when completed, was of a sort to be shunned by a timid person on the verge of slumber. There was a tiny house on the right, and a weeping family gathered in front of it. The mortgage was depicted as a cross between a fiend and an ogre, and held an axe uplifted in his red right hand. A figure with streaming black locks was staying the blow, and this, Rebecca explained complacently, was intended as a likeness of herself, though she was rather vague as to the method she should use in attaining her end. He's terrible, said Emma Jane, but awfully wizen and small. It's only a $1,200 mortgage, said Rebecca, and that's called a small one. John saw a man once that was mortgaged for $12,000. Shall you be a writer or an editor? Asked Emma Jane presently. If one had only to choose, the thing were done. As if one had only to choose, and the thing were done. I shall have to do what turns up first, I suppose. Why not go out as a missionary to Syria, as the Birches are always coaxing you to? The board would pay your expenses. I can't make up my mind to be a missionary, Rebecca answered. I'm not good enough in the first place, and I don't feel a call, as Mr. Birch says you must. I would like to do something for somebody and make things move somewhere. But I don't want to go thousands of miles away teaching people how to live when I haven't learned myself. It isn't as if the heathen really needed me. I'm sure they'll come out all right in the end. I can't see how, of all the people who ought to go out to save them stay at home as we do, argued Emma Jane. Why, whatever God is and wherever He is, He must always be there, ready and waiting. He can't move about and miss people. It may take the heathen a little longer to find Him, but God will make allowances, of course. He knows if they live in such hot climates, it must make them lazy and slow. And the parrots and tigers and snakes and breadfruit trees distract their minds. And having no books, they can't think as well, but they'll find God somehow, sometime. What if they die first? Asked Emma Jane. Oh, well, that can't be blamed. They can't be blamed for that. They don't die on purpose, said Rebecca, with a comfortable theology. In these days, Adam Ladd sometimes went to Temperance on business connected with the proposed branch of the railroad familiarly known as the York and Yankum. And while there he gained an inkling of Sunnybrook affairs, the building of the new road was not yet a certainty, and there was a difference of opinion as to the best route from Temperance to Plumville. In one event, the way would lead directly through Sunnybrook from corner to corner, and Mrs. Randall would be compensated. In the other, her interests would not be affected either for good or ill, save as all land in the immediate neighborhood might rise a little in value. Coming from Temperance to Wareham one day, Adam had a long walk and talk with Rebecca, whom he thought looking pale and thin, though she was holding bravely to her self-imposed hours of work. She was wearing a black cashmere dress that had been her Aunt Jane's second best. We are familiar with the heroine of romance whose foot is so exquisitely shaped that the coarsest shoe cannot conceal its perfections, and one always cherishes a doubt of the statement. Yet it is true that Rebecca's peculiar and individual charm seemed wholly independent of accessories. The lines of her figure, the rare coloring of skin and hair and eyes triumphed over shabby clothing, though, had the advantage of artistic appeal been given her, the little world of Wareham would probably at once have dubbed her a beauty. The long black braids were now disposed after a quaint fashion of her own. They were crossed behind, carried up to the front, and crossed again, the tapering ends finally brought down and hidden in the thicker part at the neck. Then a purely feminine touch was given to the hair that waved back from the face, a touch that rescued little crests and wavelets from the bondage and set them free to take a new color in the sun. Adam Ladd looked at her in a way that made her put her hands over her face and laugh through them shyly as she said, I know what you are thinking, Mr. Aladdin. That my dress is an inch longer than last year, and my hair different. But I'm not nearly a young lady yet. Truly, I'm not. 16 is a month of steel. 16 is a month off steel, and you promised not to give me up till my dress trails. If you don't like me to grow old, why don't you grow young? Then we can meet in the halfway house and have nice times. Now that I think about it, she continued, that's just what you've been doing all along when you bought the soap. I thought you were Grandfather Sawyer's age. When you danced with me at the flag raising, you seemed like my father. But when you showed me your mother's picture, I felt as if you were my John, because I was so sorry for you. That will do very well, smiled Adam, unless you go so swiftly that you become my grandmother before I really need one. You are studying too hard, Miss Rebecca Rowena. Just a little, she confessed. But vacation comes soon, you know. And are you going to have a good rest and try to recover your dimples? They are really worth preserving. A shadow crept over Rebecca's face, and her eyes suffused. Don't be kind, Mr. Aladdin. I can't bear it. It's not one of my dimply days. And she ran in at the seminary gate and disappeared with a farewell wave of her hand. Adam Ladd wended his way to the principal's office in a thoughtful mood. He had come to Wareham to unfold a plan that he had been considering for several days. This year was the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Wareham schools, and he meant to tell Mr. Morrison that in addition to his gift of 100 volumes to the reference library, he intended to celebrate it by offering prizes in English composition, a subject in which he was much interested. He wished the boys and girls of the two upper classes to compete, the award to be made to the writers of the two best essays. As to the nature of the prizes, he had not quite made up his mind, but they would be substantial ones, either of money or of books. This interview accomplished, he called upon Miss Maxwell, thinking as he took the path through the woods, Rose Red Snow White needs the help, and since there is no way of my giving it to her without causing remark, she must earn it. Poor little soul. I wonder if my money is always to be useless, where most I wish to spend it. He had scarcely greeted his hostess when he said, Miss Maxwell, does it strike you that our friend Rebecca looks wretchedly tired? She does indeed, and I am considering whether I can take her away with me. I always go south for the spring vacation, traveling by sea to Old Point Comfort, and rusticating in some quiet spot nearby. I should like nothing better than to have Rebecca for a companion. The very thing, assented Adam heartily. But why should you take the whole responsibility? Why not let me help? I am greatly interested in the child and have been for some years. You needn't pretend you discovered her, interrupted Miss Maxwell warmly, for I did that myself. She was an intimate friend of mine long before you ever came to Wareham, laughed Adam, and he told Miss Maxwell the circumstances of his first meeting with Rebecca. From the beginning, I've tried to think of a way I could be useful in her development, but no reasonable solution seemed to offer itself. Luckily, she attends to her own development, answered Miss Maxwell. In a sense, she is independent of everything and everybody. She follows her saint without being conscious of it, but she needs 100 practical things that money would buy for her, and alas, I have a slender purse. Take mine, I beg, and let me act through you, pleaded Adam. I could not bear to see even a young tree trying its best to grow without light or air. How much less a gifted child? I interviewed her aunts a year ago, hoping I might be permitted to give her a musical education. I assured them it was a most ordinary occurrence, and that I was willing to be repaid later on if they insisted, but it was no use. The elder Miss Sawyer remarked that no member of her family ever had lived on charity, and she guessed they wouldn't begin at this late day. I rather like that uncompromising New England grit, exclaimed Miss Maxwell. And so far I don't regret one burden that Rebecca has borne or one sorrow that she has shared. Necessity has only made her brave. Poverty has only made her daring and self-reliant. As to her present needs, there are certain things only a woman ought to do for a girl, and I should not like to have you do them for Rebecca. I should feel that I was wounding her pride and self-respect, even though she were ignorant. But there is no reason why I may not do them if necessary and let you pay her traveling expenses. I would accept those for her without the slightest embarrassment, but I agree that the matter would better be kept private between us. You are a real fairy godmother, exclaimed Adam, shaking her hand warmly. Would it be less trouble for you to invite her roommate too, the pink and white inseparable? No, thank you. I prefer to have Rebecca all to myself, said Miss Maxwell. I can understand that, replied Adam absent-mindedly. I mean, of course, that one child is less trouble than two. There she is now. Here Rebecca appeared in sight, walking down the quiet street with a lad of 16. They were in animated conversation and were apparently reading something aloud to each other, for the black-haired and the curly-brown one were both bent over a sheet of letter paper. Rebecca kept glancing up at her companion, her eyes sparkling with appreciation. Miss Maxwell, said Adam, I am a trustee of this institution, but upon my word I don't believe in co-education. I have my own occasional hours of doubt, she answered, but surely its disadvantages are reduced to a minimum with children. That is a very impressive sight which you are privileged to witness, Mr. Ladd. The folk in Cambridge often gloated on the spectacle of Longfellow and Lowell arm in arm. The little school world of Wareham palpitates with excitement when it sees the senior and the junior editors of the Pilot walking together. Chapter 25. Roses of Joy. The day before Rebecca started for the South with Miss Maxwell, she was in the library with Emma Jane and Huldah, consulting dictionaries and encyclopedias. As they were leaving, they passed the locked cases containing the library of fiction, open to the teachers and townspeople, but forbidden to the students. They looked longingly through the glass, getting some little comfort from the titles of the volumes. As hungry children imbibe emotional nourishment from the pies and tarts inside a confectioner's window, Rebecca's eyes fell upon a new book in the corner, and she read the name aloud with delight. The Rose of Joy. Listen, girls, isn't that lovely? The Rose of Joy. It looks so beautiful, and it sounds beautiful. What does it mean, I wonder? I guess everybody has a different rose, said Huldah shrewdly. I know what mine would be, and I'm not ashamed to own it. I'd like a year in a city with just as much money as I wanted to spend. Horses and splendid clothes and amusements every minute of the day. And I'd like above everything to live with people that wear low necks. Poor Huldah never took off her dress without bewailing the fact that her lot was cast in Riverboro, where her pretty white shoulders could never be seen. That would be fun for a while anyway, Emma Jane remarked. But wouldn't that be pleasure more than joy? Oh, I've got an idea. Don't shriek so, said the startled Huldah. I thought it was a mouse. I don't have them very often, apologized Emma Jane. Ideas, I mean. This one shook me like a stroke of lightning. Rebecca, couldn't it be success? That's good, mused Rebecca. I can see that success would be a joy, but it doesn't seem to me like a rose somehow. I was wondering if it could be love. I wish we could have a peep at the book. It must be perfectly elegant, said Emma Jane. But now you say it is love, I think that's the best guess yet. All day long the four words haunted and possessed Rebecca. She said them over to herself continually. Even the prosaic Emma Jane was affected by them, for in the evening she said, I don't expect you to believe it, but I have another idea. That's 2 in one day. I had it while I was putting cologne on your head. The rose of joy might be helpfulness. If it is, then it is always blooming in your dear little heart, you darlingest kind Emmy, taking such good care of your troublesome Becky. Don't dare to call yourself troublesome. You're my rose of joy. That's what you are. And the two girls hugged each other affectionately. Ah. In the middle of the night, Rebecca touched Emma Jane on the shoulder softly. Are you very fast asleep, Emmy? She whispered. Not so very, answered Emma Jane drowsily. I thought of something new. If you sang, or painted, or wrote, not a little, but beautifully, you know, wouldn't the doing of it, just as much as you wanted, give you the rose of joy? It might, if it was a real talent, answered Emma Jane, though I don't like it so well as love. If you have another thought, Becky, keep it till morning. I did have one more inspiration, said Rebecca, when they were dressing next morning, but I didn't wake you. I wondered if the rose of joy could be sacrificed. I think sacrifice would be a lily, not a rose, don't you? The journey southward, the first glimpse of the ocean, the strange new scenes, the ease and delicious freedom, the intimacy with Miss Maxwell, almost intoxicated Rebecca. In 3 days she was not only herself again, she was another self, thrilling with delight, anticipation, and realization. She had always had such eager hunger for knowledge, such thirst for love, such passionate longing for the music, the beauty, the poetry of existence. She had always been straining to make the outward world conform to her inward dreams. And now life had grown all at once, rich and sweet, wide and full. She was using all her natural, God-given outlets, and Emily Maxwell marveled daily at the inexhaustible way in which girls poured out and gathered in the treasures of thought and experience that belonged to her. She was a life-giver, altering the whole scheme of any picture she made a part of by contributing new values. Have you never seen the dull blues and greens of a room changed, transfigured by a burst of sunshine? That seemed to Miss Maxwell the effect of Rebecca on the groups of people with whom they now and then mingled. But they were commonly alone, reading to each other and having quiet talks. The prize essay was very much on Rebecca's mind. Secretly, she thought she could never be happy unless she won it. She cared nothing for the value of it, and in this case almost nothing for the honor. She wanted to please Mr. Aladdin and justify his belief in her. If I ever succeed in choosing a subject, I must ask if you think I can write well on it, and then I suppose I must work in silence and secret, never even reading the essay to you, nor talking about it. Miss Maxwell and Rebecca were sitting by a little brook on a sunny spring day. They had been in a stretch of wood by the sea since breakfast, going every now and then for a bask on the warm white sand, and returning to their shady solitude when tired of the sun's glare. The subject is very important, said Miss Maxwell, but I do not dare choose for you. Have you decided on anything yet? No, Rebecca answered. I plan a new essay every night. I've begun one on what is failure, and another on he and she. That would be a dialogue between a boy and a girl just as they were leaving school and would tell their ideals of life. Then do you remember you said to me one day, "Follow your saint"? I'd love to write about that. I didn't have a single thought in Wareham, and now I have a new one every minute. So I must try and write the essay here. Think it out, at any rate, while I am so happy and free and rested. Look at the pebbles at the bottom of the pool, Miss Emily. Look at the pebbles in the bottom of the pool, Miss Emily, so round and smooth and shining. Yes, but where did they get that beautiful polish, that satin skin, that lovely shape, Rebecca? Not in the still pool lying on the sands. It was never there that their angles were rubbed off and their rough surfaces polished. But in the strife and warfare of running waters, they have jostled against other pebbles, dashed against sharp rocks, and now we look at them and call them beautiful. If fate had not made somebody a teacher, she might have been, oh, such a splendid preacher, rhymed Rebecca. Oh, if I could only think and speak as you do, she sighed. I am so afraid I shall never get education enough to make a good writer. You could worry about plenty of other things to better advantage, said Miss Maxwell, a little scornfully. Be afraid, for instance, that you won't understand human nature, that you won't realize the beauty of the outer world, that you may lack sympathy and thus never be able to read a heart, that your faculty of expression may not keep pace with your ideas, 1,000 things, every one of them more important to the writer than the knowledge that is found in books. Aesop was a Greek slave who could not even write down his wonderful fables, yet all the world reads them. I didn't know that, said Rebecca, with a half sob. I didn't know anything until I met you. You will only have a high school course, but the most famous universities do not always succeed in making men and women. When I long to go abroad and study, I always remember that there were 3 great schools in Athens and 2 in Jerusalem, but the teacher of all teachers came out of Nazareth, a little village hidden away from the bigger, busier world. Mr. Ladd says that you are almost wasted on Wareham, said Rebecca thoughtfully. He is wrong. My talent is not a great one. But no talent is wholly wasted unless its owner chooses to hide it in a napkin. Remember that of your own gifts, Rebecca. They may not be praised of men, but they may cheer, console, inspire, perhaps, when and where you least expect. The brimming glass that overflows its own rim moistens the earth about it. Did you ever hear of the Rose of Joy? Asked Rebecca after a long silence. Yes, of course. Where did you see it? On the outside of a book in the library? I saw it on the inside of a book in the library, smiled Miss Maxwell. It is from Emerson, but I'm afraid you haven't quite grown up to it, Rebecca, and it is one of the things impossible to explain. Oh, try me, dear Miss Maxwell, pleaded Rebecca. Perhaps by thinking hard I can guess a little bit what it means. In the actual, this painful kingdom of time and chance are care, canker, and sorrow. With thought, with the ideal, is immortal hilarity, the rose of joy. Round it all the muses sing, quoted Miss Maxwell. Rebecca repeated it over and over again until she had learned it by heart. Then she said, I don't want to be conceited, but I almost believe I do understand it, Miss Maxwell. Not altogether, perhaps, because it is puzzling and difficult, but a little, enough to go on with. It's as if a splendid shape galloped past you on horseback. You are so surprised and your eyes move so slowly you cannot half see it. But you just catch a glimpse as it whisks by, and you know it is beautiful. It's all settled. My essay is going to be called The Rose of Joy. I've just decided. It hasn't any beginning, nor any middle, but there will be a thrilling ending. Something like this. Let me see. Joy, boy, toy, ahoy, decoy, alloy. Then come what will, of weal or woe, since all gold hath alloy. Thou'lt bloom unwithered in this heart, my rose of joy. Now I'm going to tuck you up in the shawl and give you the fur pillow, and while you sleep I'm going down on the shore and write a fairy story for you. It's one of our supposing kind. It flies far, far into the future and makes beautiful things happen that may never really all come to pass, but some of them will, you'll see, and then you'll take out the little fairy story from your desk and remember Rebecca. I wonder why these young things always choose subjects that would tax the powers of a great essayist, thought Miss Maxwell as she tried to sleep. Are they dazzled, captivated, taken possession of by the splendor of the theme, and do they fancy they can ride up to it? Poor little innocents, hitching their toy wagons to the stars. How pretty this particular innocent looks under her new sunshade. Adam Ladd had been driving through Boston streets on a cold spring day, when nature and the fashion mongers were holding out promises which seemed far from performance. Suddenly, his vision was assailed by the sight of a rose-colored parasol gaily unfurled in a shop window, signaling the passer-by and setting him to dream of summer sunshine. It reminded Adam of a New England apple tree in full bloom, the outer covering of deep pink shining through the thin white lining, and a fluffy fringe-like edge of mingled rose and cream dropping over the green handle. All at once he remembered one of Rebecca's early confidences, the little pink sunshade that had given her the only peep into the gay world of fashion that her childhood had ever known, her adoration of the flimsy bit of finery and its tragic and sacrificial end. He entered the shop, bought the extravagant bauble, and expressed it to Wareham at once, not a single doubt of its appropriateness crossing the darkness of his masculine mind. He thought only of the joy in Rebecca's eyes, of the poise of her head under the apple blossom canopy. It was a trifle embarrassing to return an hour later and buy a blue parasol for Emma Jane Perkins, but it seemed increasingly difficult, as the years went on, to remember her existence at all the proper times and seasons. This is Rebecca's fairy story, copied the next day and given to Emily Maxwell just as she was going to her room for the night. She read it with tears in her eyes and sent it to Adam Ladd, thinking he had earned a share in it, and that he deserved a glimpse of the girl's budding imagination as well as of her grateful young heart. A fairy story. There was once a tired and rather poverty-stricken princess who dwelt in a cottage on the great highway between two cities. She was not as unhappy as thousands of others. Indeed, she had much to be grateful for, but the life she lived and the work she did were full hard for one who was fashioned slenderly. Now the cottage stood by the edge of a great green forest, where the wind was always singing in the branches and the sunshine filtering through the leaves. And one day, when the princess was sitting by the wayside, quite spent by her labor in the fields, she saw a golden chariot rolling down the king's highway, and in it a person who could be none other than somebody's fairy godmother on her way to court. The chariot halted at her door, and though the princess had read of such beneficent personages, She never dreamed for an instant that one of them could ever alight at her cottage. "If you are tired, poor little princess, why do you not go into the cool green forest and rest?" asked the fairy godmother. "Because I have no time," she answered. "I must get back to my plough." "Is that plough leaning by the tree? And is it not too heavy?" "It is heavy," answered the princess, "but I love to turn the hard earth into soft furrows and know that I am making good soil wherein my seeds may grow. When I feel the weight too much, I try to think of the harvest." The golden chariot passed on, and the two talked no more together that day. Nevertheless, the king's messengers were busy, for they whispered one word into the ear of the fairy godmother, and another into the ear of the princess, though so faintly that neither of them realized that the king had spoken. The next morning, a strong man knocked at the cottage door, and doffing his hat to the princess said, "A golden chariot passed me yesterday, and one within it flung me a purse of ducats, saying, 'Go out into the king's highway and search until you find a cottage and a heavy plough leaning against a tree nearby. Enter and say to the princess whom you will find there, I will guide the plough and you must go and rest, or walk in the cool green forest, for this is the command of your fairy godmother.'" The same thing happened every day, and every day the tired princess walked in the green wood. Many times she caught the glitter of the chariot and ran into the highway to give thanks to the fairy godmother, but she was never fleet enough to reach the spot. She could only stand with eager eyes and longing heart as the chariot passed by. Yet she never failed to catch a smile, and sometimes a word or two floated back to her. Words that sounded like, "I would not be thanked. We are all children of the same king, and I am only his messenger." Now as the princess walked daily in the green forest, hearing the wind singing in the branches and seeing the sunlight filter through the lattice work of green leaves, there came unto her thoughts that had lain asleep in the stifling air of the cottage and the weariness of guiding the plough. And by she took a needle from her girdle and pricked the thoughts on the leaves of the trees and sent them into the air to float hither and thither. And it came to pass that people began to pick them up and holding them against the sun to read what was written on them, and this was because the simple little words on the leaves were only, after all, a part of one of the king's messages, such as the fairy godmother dropped continually from her golden chariot. But the miracle of the story lies deeper than all this. Whenever the princess pricked the words upon the leaves, she added a thought of her fairy godmother, and folding it close within, sent the leaf out on the breeze to float hither and thither and fall where it would. And many other little princesses felt the same impulse and did the same thing, and as nothing is ever lost in the king's dominion, so these thoughts and wishes and hopes, being full of love and gratitude, had no power to die, but took unto themselves other shapes and lived on forever. They cannot be seen, our vision is too weak, nor heard, our hearing is too dull, but they can sometimes be felt, and we know not what force is stirring our hearts to nobler aims. The end of the story is not come, but it may be that someday when the fairy godmother has a message to deliver in person, straight to the king, he will say, "Your face I know, your voice, your thoughts, and your heart. I have heard the rumble of your chariot wheels on the great highway, and I knew that you were on the king's business. Here in my hand is a sheaf of messages from every quarter of my kingdom. They were delivered by weary and footsore travelers who said that they could never have reached the gate in safety had it not been for your help and inspiration. Read them, that you may know when and where and how you sped the king's service. And when the fairy godmother reads them, it may be the sweet odors will rise from the pages, and half-forgotten memories will stir the air. But in the gladness of the moment, nothing will be half so lovely as the voice of the king when he said, "Read and know how you sped the king's service." Rebecca Rowena Randall.